I'm Amy Cellucci, and today I will be talking to you about intellectual disabilities. So we'll start off by defining what an intellectual disability is. So an intellectual disability are characterized by limitations in intellectual functioning and adaptive behaviors which affect the everyday lifestyle of these people. They have an onset age before 18, and they can be caused from genetic issues, problems that occur during pregnancy, problems at the birth, problems after birth, poverty issues, or cultural deprivation. So a cultural example of cultural deprivation would be malnutrition, which then leads to poor development and ends in an intellectual disability of a child. So one common intellectual disability is Down syndrome. There are 350,000 diagnosed cases of Down syndrome in the United States alone. Some physical characteristics include low muscle tone, a small stature overall, an upward slant of the eyes, a single deep crease across the center of the palm. Another common characteristic is this gap between the first and second digits over here. There's also an increased risk of some medical conditions that include congenital heart defects, respiratory and hearing problems. Alzheimer's is often a disease that affects people with Down syndrome later in life, and childhood leukemia and thyroid conditions. Another intellectual disability includes Prader-Willi syndrome. So this is a genetic disorder as well that affects appetite, growth, and metabolism and cognitive function and behavior of the person. They also, like Down syndrome, will experience low muscle tone and a short stature. In addition to that, there will be incomplete sexual development of the person. There will be cognitive disabilities and behavior problems as well. One of the most recognizable characteristic of this syndrome is the insatiable hunger that will lead to life-threatening obesity. So these people, no matter what time of day or what they've already eaten, have the feeling that they need to eat. So they will do whatever they can do to get their hands on food. Another physical characteristic of this syndrome is this almond-shaped eye over here. So fetal alcohol syndrome is another one. Those physical characteristics include a small head, short height, along with Prader-Willi and Down syndrome also experience that, and a low body weight, along with this large gap between the two eyes is another physical characteristic. They will also experience poor coordination, problems with the heart and kidneys, and bones. Fetal alcohol syndrome is 100% preventable. All the mother has to do is not consume any alcohol during her pregnancy, and there will be zero risk of her child having fetal alcohol syndrome. So, exercise response on people with Down syndrome, these people experience a lower VO2 peak than people of their same age without Down syndrome, along with a lower maximum heart rate or peak heart rate. This is thought to be because of the chronotropic incompetence, which means that there's an inability to raise the heart rate when experiencing exercise, which then leads to a smaller limited cardiac output, which leads back to the lower VO2 max. And then obesity is also a very common problem in people with Down syndrome, and that is also thought to reduce the exercise capacity in this population. So Prader-Willi, since they have that insatiable hunger that causes obesity, will experience the same response to exercise that any typically developing person with obesity would experience. And fetal alcohol syndrome, these children have a very hard time producing a consistent isometric force over a period of time. So that in turn impedes our abilities to perform daily motor skills and activities. So this is a chart that explains that. The dark dotted line is the force that they were aiming for, the summation of the different subjects. And this graph over here on the left was children with fetal alcohol syndrome, and the graph over here on the right was children of the same age without fetal alcohol syndrome. And these various lines show the different forces that were reached throughout the experiment. As you can see, in the cases of children without fetal alcohol syndrome, it was much closer and consistent over the period of time, as opposed to the children without it who could not contain this isometric force they were pushing on a force plate over the same period of time. So this graph shows the extent to which people with intellectual disabilities are meeting health-related physical activity. And as you can see, in the United States, 28% of adults with intellectual disabilities are not meeting the health-related physical activity criteria, as opposed to the 58% of adults that do not have an intellectual disability that are meeting. So there is significant decrease in adults with intellectual disabilities who are not meeting these criteria, and just shows that we need to improve the education in that population to show them how important exercise is. So obesity and intellectual disabilities are a big problem. It is thought to be more because of access barriers rather than that they don't have the knowledge that they should be exercising. That also goes along with people with an intellectual disability have caregivers that spend all day with them, and it is thought that we should educate those people more on the importance of exercise in this population. So this graph shows, again, the obesity difference, the incidence of obesity in adults with disabilities and without. And as you can see, this bar on the left shows that adults that have an intellectual disability experience obesity at a higher percentage. This is the case study. We will be talking about Kevin. He is a 25-year-old male who has Down syndrome. He does not smoke and has no family history of cardiac events. And when he's not at work at his local grocery store, he likes to play video games. So we already know that he has no family history. He is a non-smoker, so that's not a risk factor. But he does seem to lead a sedentary lifestyle, which shows in his numbers. He is 150 pounds at 4 feet and 11 inches, which results in a body mass index of 30, which puts him in the obese category. His HDLs are 126 and LDLs are 54, which are within typical range, but his fasting plasma glucose at 130 puts him at the diabetic stage. And his VO2 max, you can see, is lower. It's at 17, but that is typical for a person who has Down syndrome. It is typical for their VO2 maxes to be as low as 15 and 20 between those numbers. So that's not out of the ordinary. And he doesn't have a family history of cardiac events, but it is also typical of a person with Down syndrome to experience congenital heart failure at birth or a younger age. Those are taken care of at that time, but you need the history of that so you can be vigilant of it. Since he is diabetic, we're going to have to check his plasma glucose before he begins exercise to make sure it's not at those contraindication numbers of greater than 200 or less than 90, in which case he would not exercise on those days. So the exercise testing protocol for a person with Down syndrome mostly follows the typical protocol. We would do a walking treadmill protocol as opposed to running, because there tend to be balance issues with people of Down syndrome, and also the obesity factor plays in, so we don't want the heavy pounding on the joints with the running. Resistance training we would do on machines instead of free weights to counteract the extreme joint laxity that a person of Down syndrome experiences, and we would insist upon proper form. Flexibility, since they have that hyperflexibility with joint laxity, we need to keep an eye on that to make sure they're not hyperextending. So a sit and reach protocol is good with that, just again making sure they're not hyperextending. And we would also have a simple explanation of all procedures to break it down as few steps as possible so it's easier to understand, but not in a condescending type of way. So for Kevin's cardiovascular workouts, he would go 3 to 7 days a week at a 50 to 80% heart rate reserve intensity, and keeping in mind that he will experience a lower heart rate reserve and peak heart rate and VO2 max than a person without Down syndrome of his age. We would quantify this on a RPE scale at 12 to 16 on the scale of 6 to 20. We would aim to get 150 minutes for the whole week. He could get to that by 10-minute bouts throughout the day, which, as we've talked about before, by getting those 10-minute bouts, you get all the major muscle groups working, which for Kevin, since he is a diabetic, would be good to get the insulin into the cells, since muscle contraction is one of the two ways that insulin can get into the cells. And we would involve all the large muscle groups. A good way for Kevin to get into this would be Special Olympics is an option. They have lots of teams would also get the social interaction that he's lacking since he's not getting much throughout the day. Resistance training, he would have him go about 2 to 3 days a week, doing 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps at 60-80%. Keeping in mind, since they have that low muscle tone, there'll be lower muscle strength. So compared to someone of his age who does not have Down syndrome, those muscles will be lower, but for him it'll be just fine. We want to hit about 8 to 10 major muscle groups and do this on machines that are properly adjusted for his height, which could be difficult since Down syndrome, you have that short stature, and if it doesn't fit on the machines, you could do free weights, but just being very sure that the form is correct and you're not going out of that range of motion in the joints. Flexibility could be done 2 to 3 days a week on the days that resistance training is not done. We would go about 10 to 20 minute sessions to a stretch of just mild discomfort, again keeping an eye on the range of motion, making sure there's no hyperextension. And yoga would be a good way to do this. You could get that group bond going on. You also could focus on, with the flexibility, core strength to keep, since there is that hyperflexibility, you want to protect the spine as much as you can. So engaging the core, strengthening the core would be good for that. And then medications for people with intellectual disabilities antidepressants is a common one. On the exercise response, you want to watch the heart rate and the blood pressure on their acute and chronic effects of that antidepressants might have on it. And then insulin, since obesity is an epidemic in the intellectual disabled culture or population, you would want to make sure that the medication time and the amount of insulin that they're taking coincides with the times they're going to be exercising, so the insulin really pushed through the muscles with exercise isn't too much or too little for them at that time of day. So after talking about intellectual disabilities and exercise, just to keep in mind that the severity of the intellectual disability from person to person will vary. So the cognitive amount that they'll understand and be willing to do will be case dependent. You have to be patient in your explanation, since it might take a few times for them to understand it. You need to expect lower work rate capacities and maximum heart rates due to those chemical imbalances that can happen. And always keeping in mind that people with Down syndrome will have more joint laxity, so you need to watch out for the hyperextension and keeping in that range of motion. But other than these few contraindications, protocols, a person with an intellectual disability can do just as much physical activity as a typically developing person of that age.